We are joined by Dr. Stuart Squires, who's going to share with us a crucial element in understanding the Eucharist and sharing it with others, how we need to look at the Eucharist through the eyes of the first century Jews. This is one element that we captured in our film, The New Manna, that we're currently funding to complete post-production. So to donate and learn more, go to thenewmannamovie.com. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Dr. Stuart Squires. I am the director of a program that's launching this fall at St. John's Seminary. We are the seminary for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, and we have seminarians from men in all kinds of different dioceses from the Southwest. This program that we're launching is an online program, a master's program in pastoral ministry for lay people who, for example, work in parishes or Newman centers, and permanent deacons who are looking for a continuing education.
It's awesome. And so, how come you were able to come to our church? In this case, it was a Holy Family, Glendale. It's people. Anybody can invite you over. I mean, or just strictly for California? It's something is done for all over United States. What's it like?
Yeah, so the Archdiocese of Los Angeles just completed I think it was a 4-part series, the Catholic Bible Institute at the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, because of the Eucharistic revival that the U.S. Catholic Church is going through. This Catholic Bible Institute had 4 presentations on the Eucharist from different perspectives in different parishes throughout the Archdiocese. And 6 months ago, they invited me to give a talk. And the talk that I gave, and I think we're going to talk a bit about that today, comes from a chapter on a book that I'm getting published this fall on the Eucharist, specifically the fruits of the Eucharist. What does it do by the Focolare movement, their press called New City Press.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Yeah, thank you very much. I was really impressed for how clean and how appealing. And there was a priest one time told to me, he was a big theologian, he has 6 PhD, a master degree.
Wow.
He say, I have to dumb things down for you guys. And it's so nice when somebody can do it, because I think it shows a well understanding of the matter. And I mean, to be able to vocalize it properly to the audience, that's what is our goal. So feel free to start your presentation and to be able to bring us some the good news.
Good, thank you. Yeah, so we of course can take the question of the Eucharist in a million different ways, and what I presented in Glendale a few weeks ago and wanted to share with you today is a sort of narrow, specific question. When we talk about the Eucharist, we as Catholics believe in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, so that the Eucharist is more than a symbol, it's more than a metaphor. I think a mistake a lot of Catholics make is that they believe that God's presence to his people first started in the Eucharist, right? At the institution of the Eucharist on Holy Thursday, the night Jesus was betrayed, the Last Supper, or we'll back it up to the Bread of Life discourse in John chapter 6. But the idea of God being present to his people, it goes back to the Old Testament, and then those themes, the specific themes that we can talk about here, repeat themselves in the New Testament. And so in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word, as you can see here on the screen, Shekinah, from the verb shekin, meaning to dwell or abide, that God dwells or abides with his people. And he does so in a variety of different ways, but arguably the 3 most important are in the tabernacle, in the temple, and in the bread of presence. And that when we see God being present to his people in the New Testament, it's not a radically new or different or a break from those 3 themes, but those 3 themes are repeated again in the person of Jesus. So that's kind of where our conversation should head today.
That's fantastic. Yes, please feel free to start in. I mean, and for the viewers, I mean, it's the first times they come in and join us today. And I mean, we are making a movie about the Eucharistic miracles and all the representation of the Eucharistic Bible passages, and this is going to be unified with what the Archdiocese of Los Angeles is doing and what the Church, the Catholic Church, is doing for revival for the Eucharist.
So let's start with the first theme, the tabernacle. So when the Israelites were liberated from slavery in Egypt, and of course, we all know that they wandered the desert for 40 years, and lots of things happened. Of course, they received the law, they fell into idolatry. And one of the things is that God, here we see in Exodus 25, commanded, quote, make a sanctuary for me that I may dwell in their midst. And in for the tabernacle, and the temple, the Old Testament actually has some fairly specific measurements. So we can get a pretty good understanding of what the tabernacle and then the two temples, because there were two. First one was destroyed, and then the second one by the Romans in the year 70. So we have a pretty good idea. So you can Google and you can images of what artist renderings would be. And so we have an artist rendering here. So it's a sort of the word tabernacle coming from the word tabernaculum in Latin, which just means tent, right? So this is a nomadic people. They're wandering the desert. So when they move, you've got to be able to move the tabernacle. So it was not a stone structure. And God gives details, instructions to Moses on what this tabernacle and then later the temple should look like. Among other details, God commanded that the mercy seat be placed atop the ark. And we all, of course, know about the ark from Indiana Jones. In the ark was, among other things, the covenant, the tablets. And in Exodus, we learn God would meet you, Moses, there, and I would tell you all that I command you regarding the Israelites. So this mercy seat, again, is where God will meet Moses. And then God commanded that the Israelites to offer a sacrifice at the entrance of the temple where God will meet you and speak to you. There, the altar will be made sacred by God's glory. Thus, God said, I will consecrate the tent of meeting. That's one of the ways that tabernaculum is translated. You can see it translated in different ways in the Old Testament. So the tent of meeting and the altar, I will dwell in the midst of the Israelites and will be their God. They shall know that I, the Lord, am their God, who brought them out of the land, so that I, the Lord, their God, might dwell among them. Exodus 29. And when we talk about dwell, obviously God does not have a body. And yet at the same time, this idea of God dwelling is not an abstraction. It's not a symbol or a metaphor, simply that the idea of initially the tabernacle and then later the temple is the place on earth where God resides. It literally is where heaven and earth meet. So this is not just a sacred space in general, but the place on earth where God resides. And it's continuing on, it says, after God's orders had been completed, the column of cloud covered the tabernacle, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter because the cloud settled down upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled it. Whenever the cloud lifted, the Israelites would resume their journey, again, the journey in the desert. Only when it lifted did they move forward. The cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and fire in the cloud at night, in the sight of the whole house of Israel in all the stages of their journey through the wilderness. Exodus 40. So again, this is artist rendering. So who knows exactly what the cloud looked like, or this fire, pillar of fire. But this is God's presence with his people. And then, of course, we know that the Israelites finally got out of the wilderness and did settle down in the land that was promised to Abraham's descendants. And David wanted to build a temple to God, a permanent physical structure. But God said no, because David had spilled so much blood in war. And God said, your son, Solomon, the third king, would be the one to do so. So when Solomon becomes king, he does. This is why we call it Solomon's temple, or the first temple, because it was then destroyed by the Babylonians. When Solomon had finished building the temple, fire, there's that theme of fire again, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offerings and sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the house. But the priests could not enter the house of the Lord, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. All the Israelites looked on while the fire came down, and the glory of the Lord was upon the house. And they fell down upon the pavement with their faces to the earth and worshipped, praising the Lord, who is so good, whose love endures forever. 2 Chronicles. Notice that repeat of that phrase there, the glory of the Lord filled the house. The glory of the Lord filled the house. We see that 3 times in basically one sentence or 2 sentences. So this idea, anytime you see something in the Bible repeat itself, that's the author or the authors trying to really underline an important point here. So the glory of the Lord filled the house. This is, again, not some sort of abstraction, that God is present with his people in the temple. And then the third theme in the temple itself is specifically something that's translated a variety of different ways. We're going to stick with the idea of the bread of the presence. So in the temple, a bronze altar was located in the courtyard in front of the temple for sacrifice. That's where they did the burnt offerings. The holy place in the temple held the altar of incense and 10 lampstands. It also contained a gold-plated table for the lehem ha-panim, which is variously translated as the bread of presence, or the showbread, or a different spelling, showbread, perpetual bread, bread of the laying out, bread of display, or bread of offering. So depending on your Bible translation, you'll see it translated one of these ways. And this is the third example of how God was present to the Israelites. God commanded that the Israelites keep the bread of presence set before me as a symbol of the covenant. The covenant, I will be your God, you will be my people, made with Abraham. Each Sabbath, so every week, 2 omers, approximately 10 pints of bran flour, were baked into 12 unleavened loaves, 1 for each tribe, and placed on the gold table. We're in the temple now, in 2 piles of 6 loaves each, with 2 bowls of frankincense between them. That word frankincense, as Christians, should start ringing bells in our brains. We're now starting to sort of anticipate already explicitly Jesus. The following Sabbath, 2 priests would approach the table. Each would remove one of the piles, and at the exact moment that the first 12 were removed, 2 other priests would replace them with 12 more. The 4 priests gave half of the removed bread to the high priest, and they, the priests, consumed the rest, right? So they didn't throw this bread out. It's a week old, but they consumed it. They ate it. So again, this idea of God being present to his people in the Old Testament, the Israelites, in 3 different ways. I can pause there before we move on to the New Testament if you wanted to unpack or explore any of those Old Testament themes.
I've met a lot of Christians that say, I can worship God on a mountain. Why do I have to go to church? God is everywhere. So why do I have to go to a certain church to worship in a certain way, as we believe as Catholics, with the Eucharist truly being present? What would you say to that?
Yeah, sure. So certainly Jews during the temple period, the first and the second temple period, would say that God can be and should be worshipped or praised, not just at the temple, but the temple. And I think a lot of Christians today sort of put in their mind synagogues and temples is kind of the same thing. A synagogue was not a temple, and to this day is not a temple, in the sense that God is present in the temple, and sacrifices aren't made in synagogues. Sacrifices only could happen at the temple, even though God could be prayed elsewhere. And when certainly the first temple was destroyed and the Israelites were taken into the Babylonian captivity, and then after the second temple, and even more so, I think, was destroyed in the year 70 by the Romans, there was a very serious existential crisis in Judaism. The center of their religion was the temple, was this space. And then the question for Jews they had to really wrestle with is, what is the center of our religion now if it's not a place? Because obviously not only was the temple destroyed, but they were sent into the diaspora. So what is the center of Judaism? And as Judaism develops over time, the answer becomes time, right? Specifically the Sabbath. So the heart of Judaism for Jews today is the idea of the Sabbath, that Sabbath time, and which is not to say that the Sabbath wasn't important during the temple period. Of course it was. That was one of the commandments, honor the Sabbath. But because place could no longer be important for Jews because the temple had been destroyed, now it becomes time.
That's great. That's great. I mean, and something, I mean, many people probably will know, I mean, but it's always come back, always an argument about the Sabbath, why we celebrating not on Saturday, but on Sunday. Can you even just really quickly, can you explaining that one too? So in this way, if some Jews people is going to view this show, I mean, they can kind of understanding as well why we do celebrate. We do celebrate on Saturday too, but we have the Sunday as a regular.
Yeah, so for Jews, the Sabbath, they have a different calendar than the calendar that Christians use. It's not well, it's based on several things. It's a little complicated and sort of a tangent here. But the most important point is days don't begin at midnight. Days begin at sundown. So the Sabbath for Jews is sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday. For Christians, the Sabbath in the early church sort of shifted towards Sunday because that's the day of the resurrection, right? That's the day that Jesus was resurrected. So that became obviously the most important day of the week for Christians. And to this day, you're not, for example, supposed to have funerals, for example, on the Sabbath, because funerals having to do with death, obviously, but for us, the Sunday is the day of the resurrection. Another maybe more immediately relevant issue is, of course, during the season of Lent, and a lot of Catholics don't know this, whatever Lenten practice you're doing for 6 days of the week, you're not supposed to do it on Sunday because that's the day of the resurrection. So even in the season of Lent, we have this sort of continual reminder, hey, yes, we are fasting, but Jesus is resurrected.
And then we are going to touch after, I mean, this resurrected concept, I mean, within the Eucharist after, I mean, but with all things is going to come together nicely. Now, you show a little clip about the Ark of the Covenant.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the people, they don't know what was inside the Ark of the Covenant, I mean, and I think it might be able to tie it with after the Eucharist as well, and with the next question.
Yeah, so the Ark of the Covenant was placed in the temple and included the tablets that Moses received for the law. And so it's sort of, you know, again, the most important things of Jewish history. And so so you have these things in the temple. But again, I think the most important thing that we need to keep in mind is the idea that the temple was the place on earth where God resides, and Jews then and now take that very seriously, not in a sort of symbolic or metaphoric way.
Yeah. So, and as well, there was the manna, the bread coming to heaven, or inside the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah.
And the stick of priesthood. Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, so the manna was what we kind of ran past this part when the Israelites were wandering in the desert for 40 years. You've got a whole nation of people. The desert has nothing in it. That's the whole idea of a desert. So the obvious question is, well, how do you live? How do you survive? And what happened, of course, is that God sent to the Israelites every day manna from heaven. We're not exactly sure what it is. It was sort of a bread-like substance. And the Israelites first responded in Hebrew, manhu, which sort of means, what is this, right? What is this thing that we're receiving every day? And that's where we get the word manna from. And the idea was that God would provide this every day, so that the Israelites needed to rely daily on God. But of course, the Israelites, as they often did, or in the Old Testament, didn't listen to God when God said, "Don't collect or store any of the manna." They did that at first, and the what they collected or stored sort of began to rot and got infected. So that was what the manna was. It was the bread that kept the Israelites alive as they journeyed through the desert.
Yeah, that's also. And there was a stick of priesthood from as well from the brother of Aaron, the brother of Moses, inside the Ark of the Covenant.
Right, the rod of Aaron. That's correct.
Yeah. So now next question is related to the bread of presence offering in the tabernacle as well, and try to bring in here some analogy with again with the bread, which is something important element since the beginning. So yeah, can you unfold? I mean, it's like this concept about the bread for why was the bread, why was separately, why they was able to eat in, and then I think there is a Bible passage as well where Christ tells that, I mean, David was able to eat the bread. Please, yeah, I feel to unfold up this part.
Yeah, and of course that was a bit controversial, because as we just saw in the passage that I quoted, that it was that only the priests who were allowed to eat the bread, and David was not a priest; he was a king, and so yes, Jesus did quote that. I think it's important, first of all, I think, to mention that it was consumed, it was eaten, again, that it wasn't thrown away, and as we sort of anticipate Jesus. I think I had said in our presentation in Glendale a few weeks ago that one thing to notice is that sort of that theme of bread of presence, which we'll talk about here in a minute in the New Testament, continues on, but that it was sort of expanded to include not just priests. Again, David wasn't a priest, but all of us, all Catholics who are in the state of grace, can and should receive. Afterwards, a woman came up and made an excellent point. She says, well, don't forget about our common priesthood as baptized believers. And I said, oh, that's an excellent point. So we are common in our baptism, the common priesthood as well, distinct from obviously the priesthood where we have priests who consecrate the bread and wine. That's not that's different. So that theme of bread being eaten by priests in the Old Testament in the temple, again, continues on through the New Testament until the present day with the Eucharist, which we'll get to here in a minute.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So should we move on to those themes in the New Testament now?
Sure.
Okay, good. So again, we talk about the bread of life discourse, or Jesus's institution of the Eucharist at the Last Supper. One thing I think that Catholics often forget is that, yes, God is present in Jesus, God is present in the Eucharist, but not just in a general way, but specifically those three themes that we were just talking about, repeating again in the New Testament. So let's start with that first theme, the tabernacle. So how is the theme of the tabernacle continuing in Jesus? And this comes from John chapter 1, the famous prologue, where we see, of course, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And this word, of course, the Greek word is logos, and Christians have understood that as the sort of the second person of the Trinity, that then becomes incarnate, right? And incarnate in the person of Jesus Christ. So verse 14 says, the Word became flesh And so, translations are different. Often you'll see it translated as "and made his dwelling among us," which is not a bad or wrong translation. We already saw in the Old Testament that Hebrew word shekin, meaning to dwell. But if we want to do a more literal translation of the Greek, because the New Testament was written in Greek, we could say that the word pitched his tent among us, right? That the word became flesh and pitched his tent among us. So any first century Jew reading in the original Greek would immediately pick up on that theme. Oh, God is pitching his tent, and would connect this to the tabernacle. This idea of the tabernacle and the temple, this is not some sort of obscure understanding of Judaism that only scholars would know. Any Jew in the first century would know the basic stories of Judaism, including the tabernacle and the temple. And so that would that idea of God pitching his tent would be immediately evident to anybody reading John 1. And then immediately after that, chapter 2, right? Chapter 2 is best known of John, is best known for the wedding feast at Cana. But this theme from going from tabernacle to temple in the Old Testament happening John chapter 1 to John chapter 2. So we see there that the Jews then asked Jesus for a sign that he could show for doing this. And Jesus said, "Destroy this temple," he responded to them, "and in 3 days I will raise it up." They pointed out the temple had been under continual renovation for the previous 46 years and were confused at this claim that he would raise it in 3 days. But he was speaking about the temple of his body. On the third day after his resurrection, when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they came to believe the scripture and the word Jesus had spoken. So again, this idea of Jesus saying, "I'll destroy this temple. If destroy this temple, and he'll raise it up in 3 days." His audience was confused because they assumed he was talking about the physical temple that, again, at this point, we're in the second temple after it had been destroyed by the Babylonians, rebuilt after the Babylonian exile, and then just a few years later would be destroyed by the Romans. But that's not what he was talking about. He was talking about the temple of his body. And of course, the raising it in 3 days is a hint at the resurrection. So what is John telling us here? He's telling us, again, this idea that God isn't simply dwelling in Jesus in a general way or an abstract way, but in that same theme of the temple. Jesus himself is calling his own body the temple. So John chapter 1, John chapter 2, tabernacle, temple, right there at the very beginning of the text. And then that third theme, the theme of the bread of presence. Again, often Christians think about the bread of life discourse, or they think about the Last Supper as the time that this idea of the bread, Jesus being present in the bread, or bread as a theme is new at that point, which is right at the end of Jesus's life, right? But what we see actually is it's right from the beginning of his life. This theme is presented to us. Remember, I already mentioned frankincense, right? That I told you to think. Keep in mind frankincense, that we know that this is one of the gifts that was given to Jesus at his birth. But even before he was born, Joseph, we see, left Nazareth to return to his hometown because of the census that was called. That is called Bethlehem. That was his hometown because he was of the house and family of David, to be enrolled with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. We all know this story. We see this story every year in the season of Advent. What a lot of Christians don't know is that in Hebrew, the place where Jesus entered the world, Bethlehem, literally means house of bread. Beth means house, and then we already saw that word lehem in Hebrew. So Bethlehem, house of bread. So Jesus is born in the house of bread. So that theme there of bread is present. This is Luke chapter 2. And just a couple of verses later, Mary, after Jesus is born, wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Again, we all know the story because of Advent. This is not, an abstract or minor story in the life of Christianity. This is a story that all Christians know. A lot of Christians don't know, though, the word manger is an animal trough comes from the Latin word mandare, which means to chew, to chew. So he's born in the house of bread, Bethlehem. And when he was born, where does Mary place him? Places him in the place where, because they're in there's no room for them in the inn. He was placed in the place where animals eat, right? In a manger, which means to chew. So those images of chewing, eating bread, already there from the beginning of Jesus's life. So anticipating what is to come later with the institution of the Eucharist. So, and then that idea of the gift of frankincense. And then, of course, we see John chapter 6, moving on to the famous bread of life discourse. My Father gives you the true bread from heaven. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. And the bread that I will give is flesh for the life of the world. My flesh is true food and my blood is true drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me and I in him. So now we're at the bread of life discourse, where Jesus is really making explicit that the Israelites, when they saw Jesus multiplying the food, saw this miracle, and they wanted sort of a sign. And Jesus said, "Well, here, you're interested in me because I gave you this fleshly food, this food that will sustain your body, but it'll only sustain your body for a day, and then you have to eat again. But I'm going to give you something more important. This is the true bread, the living bread, and that bread is my flesh. My flesh is true food." And then how do they respond? They say, "Well, who can accept this? The saying is hard." And why can't they, the Jewish audience that he's speaking to, accept it? It's not simply that when Jesus says you have to eat my body and drink my blood, or you have no life in you, that's sort of weird or strange, but specifically that it goes against Jewish law. Jews, as we know, can eat some animals, but not other animals, clean and unclean animals. But there's an absolute prohibition on drinking blood. So that when Jesus says you have to drink my blood or you have no life in you, that's not just sort of weird or creepy or strange. That's telling them to go against the Jewish law that is at the heart of their religion. So for many of his disciples, Jesus was demanding too much, so they returned to their former ways of life and no longer accompanied him, which is important. This is the only time in the four Gospels that we see people leave Jesus because of his teaching, right? Obviously, everybody except for Mary and John left him at the crucifixion, but for his teachings, this is the only time anybody left. It was so difficult for them to understand that. But he says, take this at the Last Supper now. So we're moving from the bread of life discourse to the institution of the Eucharist at the Last Supper. Take and eat, this is my body. Then Jesus took a cup, said another prayer, blessing God, and gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which will be shed on behalf of many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, from now on, I shall not drink this fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it with you new in the kingdom of my Father. So that's, again, this idea of God being present to his people in Jesus in the Eucharist is not something sort of a bolt of lightning out of the blue. This is not something radically new or different. This is continuing a theme of God being present to his people from the Old Testament, specifically the tabernacle, the temple, the bread of presence. And then when we shift to the New Testament, those three themes repeat again, but in the person of Jesus. Jesus is the tabernacle, Jesus is the temple, Jesus is the bread of presence, all in himself. So the new place of worship, again, it's not the temple. It is the physical building structure. It is now the temple of Jesus's body.
Could you go into detail on the verbiage of John 6, specifically when Jesus says, to eat my flesh, the word trogon, right? The gnawing on his flesh. Could you explain that? I know a lot of people have talked about that, and I think it's been personally helpful. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Bishop Robert Barron talks about this. He says that in the bread of life discourse, when Jesus says you have to it's usually translated, you have to eat my body. In the Greek, it's more like gnaw, and sort of like in an animalistic way. And I like that. You know, we could, I think, interpret that a million different ways, but one thing that always comes to my mind is, you know, how do animals eat different from human beings? Animals, there's no social niceties, right? You have to have a napkin, you have to have a fork and a knife on a plate, and if you get some food on your cheek, you got to wipe it off, and you don't want to have food in your teeth, you know. And if you break these sort of social norms, you know, people look at you funny or something like that. So we have very structured social norms on how people eat. But that idea of gnawing on something in an animalistic way, Bishop Barron points out that verb is usually used for animals on how they should eat. Animals don't have those social norms. So one way of, I think, interpreting it is to say that we need to eat Jesus' body and drink his blood with abandon, not caring what other people think, not caring if they disagree with us on what we believe that the Eucharist is. Eat it with abandon, with a voracious appetite, I think, is one way to put it. So don't worry about the sort of niceties or social expectations. Eat it ravenously, I think, is one way we can think about that.
Yeah, and which means that, I mean, that he, even on his birth, when he was laid down on this manger, he now visually too, I mean, he's now what the meat, what usually the manger, there's probably some grass, some things, but now he's there to be, he presents himself to be in a perspective in the future, I mean, to be it as well. And I mean, so, and I think, I mean, the uniqueness too about why he used that specific word, not, is probably was for clarify what the Jewish might have thinking, or probably his meaning figuratively speaking, but I think by him using the adjective, the verb, I mean, it's specifically to clarify. So I'm wondering why, if that was clear enough for the Jew, how come it's not clear enough for the Protestant to understand there was enough figuratively speaking?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak too much about our Protestant brothers and sisters. I mean, first of all, I'm not a Protestant theologian, so I'm not an expert. And of course, the thinking about the Eucharist or communion, as I think most of them would call it, they disagree amongst themselves. So anytime you talk about Protestants, it's difficult to say, here's what Protestants believe, because you certainly might be talking about some, but not all. So yeah, I don't want to speak too much about what Protestants believe, because I'm not an expert, and you know, we you know, I just sort of want to stick to what I know and what I'm an expert in.
No, absolutely. I mean, I kind of thought it was just a fascinating, this use of words. For it. Yeah, please feel free. One question I want to know.
Yeah.
I never knew about. I mean, I'm not sure if it's something you more familiar. When the Jewish law about there was to don't eat, obviously it was not one of the commandments and stuff. How did you know the history behind where that one come from? And I mean, what how that one was being interpreted in the Jewish law to don't eat. I mean, we know that, I mean, that when Moses told to eat the lamb, everything was supposed to be eaten, the bone, the ears, the nose, everything. So did you know anything about that, how that point was developed in the Jewish law?
Well, certainly, I mean, there's always the issue of interpretation, right? So there are specific laws that are laid out about what Jews can and can't eat, the type of animals. But then, for example, you know, as you have the Jewish diaspora, and they spread out around the world and encounter new animals, then there becomes, you know, a new question of interpretation of what animals can be eaten and what others can't. But even in you know, before the sort of Jewish diaspora, there's always a sort of question of how do you interpret it. So there's one law, for example, that says you shall not boil the baby in the mother's milk. Okay, what does that mean? Well, today, you know, in America, one of the sort of standard foods is a cheeseburger, right? So a lot of observant Jews, they'll eat cheese or they'll eat a hamburger, but they will not eat a cheeseburger because they've interpreted that to mean, again, to be an offense against that law. You shall not boil the baby in the mother's milk. Now, obviously, in Jesus' time, there was no such thing as a cheeseburger. So there's always continuing on this question of interpreting laws. And I am, again, I'm not a Protestant, I'm not a Jewish rabbi, so I don't want to go too deep into this because I'm not an expert at it.
Yeah.
But even I know Jewish rabbis are continuing to have to debate this question. Think of things like, genetic engineering among food as big pharma and big agriculture are able to develop genetic different types of food. Are those foods kosher? Are Jews allowed to eat that? Again, I'm not an expert at that, so I don't want to answer that question. But there's always a continuing question of how do you apply or interpret the laws that have been handed into the given reality of the situation of today. So the third part of the presentation, and I think we can keep this a little bit short, is I wanted to say, okay, well, what about after the New Testament and the idea of this idea of God being present to his people in the Eucharist specifically. Now we can trace it in a variety of different ways throughout the 2,000-year history. And I just had 4 examples. The Didache from the 1st century, or maybe 2nd century, the Ignatius of Antioch from the 2nd century, Thomas Aquinas from the 13th century, and the Council of Trent. So for the sake of time, I think we can burn through this a little bit more quickly because I think this is probably a little bit better known to your audience. So the Didache is a text written around the same time as the New Testament texts were written. And it doesn't give us a very philosophically or theologically precise understanding of the Eucharist, but it does certainly clearly point out that this bread is qualitatively different from just the normal bread. So quoting Matthew 7, do not give what is sacred to dogs. The Didache calls it spiritual food and drink. And that if you receive it and are not reconciled to your neighbor by taking the sacred meal while in a dispute with one's neighbor, the sacrificial offering will be defiled, right? So if this is just regular bread, you can't defile it. I mean, you can drop it on the ground or something and you might not want to eat it, but that's not defiling it. So the Didache here clearly pointing to this idea that this bread is something more. St. Ignatius, one of my favorite early church saints in the early 2nd century, even more so, I think, than the Didache, pointing to this idea that there's something qualitatively different, and it's not just a metaphor. I take no delight in corruptible food, right? That's just the regular everyday food. Bread, of course, can get moldy, for example. Or the dainties of this life, Ignatius wrote, what I want is God's bread, which is the flesh of Christ, who came from David's line. And then he's also arguing against what he calls some heretics he was battling, quote, refuse to admit that the Eucharist is the flesh of our Savior, Lord Jesus Christ, which suffered for our sins and which in his goodness the Father raised. So again, from the early 2nd century, Ignatius was one of the early figures. He was arrested and was being taken overland to be martyred in Rome. Thomas Aquinas, of course, one of the great describers of how we philosophically or theologically understand the Eucharist. He is not the person who coined or first used the term transubstantiation, but is probably best associated with it. And he and others in the 13th century took philosophical categories from the pre-Christian Greek philosopher Aristotle, substance and accident, and applied those and said, hey, these categories can be used to describe the Eucharist in a very helpful way. And so the substance of the bread and wine change from bread and wine, or breadness and wineness, to the body and blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus, but the accidents remain. So that would be like the color, the texture, the smell, the taste. Those things are the accidents. They're not something that is essential to the thing. So think, for example, wine can be red or it can be white, right? So the color of it is not essential. But it's what we call an accident. And so transubstantiation is a philosophical language to describe this idea of the change that happens to the bread when it's consecrated. And then finally, the Council of Trent in the 16th century was called for several reasons, but most importantly, in response to our Protestant brothers and sisters. And it says, after the consecration of bread and wine, our Lord Jesus Christ, true God and true man, is truly, really, and substantially contained in the august sacrament of the Holy Eucharist under the appearance of these sensible things, right? So it appears to be bread and wine to our senses, taste, smell, touch, but we're deceived. And I think oftentimes this is sort of misunderstood or thought to be really weird. Even Catholics think that. But, you know, our senses they mislead us all the time. So one easy example is our senses tell us that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, but we know that's not true. What's true is that the earth spins and then goes around the sun 365 days a year. So our senses, our eyes tell us one thing, but the reality is something different. And we could come up with a long list of examples. And this is just one other example. Our senses tell us one thing. This is bread and wine, but the reality is different. This is Jesus. So that idea of God being present to his people in the bread of life, continuing down through the tradition from the first century right up until now. So that was I think that's the end of the presentation. Yeah, I just offer a quick summary here. The same theme repeats itself in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, and then this idea of the presence in the Eucharist continuing on through tradition.
How, as we as a Catholic, we have a difference between a tabernacle and a monstrance. And how would you further explaining to people the difference? I mean, for when you are in church and when you are visiting the Christ in the monstrance.
Sure. So every Catholic parish has a tabernacle. Sometimes you can't see it. It might be kind of in a corner or around the corner or something. What you should always do is look for a red candle that will point to where the tabernacle is, and it's usually a sort of metal enclosure, so you can't see the Eucharist. And what is in there are the technical word is host, so a little wafer that has already been consecrated. So it is the body and blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. And it is reserved there. So if a priest celebrates Mass, and then after the Eucharist has been given to the faithful, if there is extra left, or not extra, but leftover, I guess we could say, it is then reserved in the tabernacle. So the Eucharist, again, is always present there in the parish, echoing back to that idea of the tabernacle and the temple. So this is why, for example, a sort of a practical difference between Catholics and Protestants is if you walk into a Catholic, especially like a mega church, people will be talking, they'll have coffee, they're not watching the tone of their voice. But because we believe that Jesus is present in the tabernacle in a Catholic church or a Catholic parish, when you walk in, there'll be no talking or maybe some whispering, because we believe that God is present there in the tabernacle. So you have a sort of cultural response, different cultural response to the space that we're in. We Catholics believe that is sacred space because Jesus is present in the tabernacle. And whereas, again, Protestants disagree among themselves, but like the mega churches, it's not really sacred space. It's no space different because they don't believe that Jesus is present in a tabernacle. And then you brought up the monstrance. So the monstrance is when people are adoring, having set, for example, an hour of adoration, that a priest or a deacon will put a host. It's usually a bigger host, so you can see it. The ones that we consume are small wafers, but oftentimes in the monstrance you'll have a bigger host so that you can visually see it. It will be placed in a monstrance, and then which is another casing, and often it'll be sort of gold or gold plated, maybe, obviously not usually not entire gold, and then placed on the altar so that Catholics can worship it. So it's just a different way of holding or housing it, right? So it's not a different host. It's still Jesus. It's still just like the hosts in the tabernacle. In the tabernacle, although it might physically, the host might be a bit bigger, and it's now being exposed for us to adore it.
Yeah, there is a beautiful story. I don't know if you never heard about San Padre Pio that was being told even from my godfather that one time they removed from the tabernacle the host and placed it to another place to see if he was aware about it. And as soon as he came inside the room, right away he genuflected towards where the host was hidden. I think this is a good example for what you were mentioning probably before about our senses, our things is not because it's something we don't see, we don't feel, it's not present. There is the element, even if we don't see it, we can let that affect our believing. Now, my question is to you, what's the difference between being in front of the tabernacle and praying and being in front of the monstrance and I mean, why the Catholic Church emphasize more that so-called presence within when let's say is open more to the public, the monstrance versus the tabernacle being closed?
Yeah, that story about Padre Pio reminds me of a story of Mother Teresa as she was dying in the hospital. She was being in India. I think it was a Hindu doctor, and of course he didn't know anything about Catholicism, but he was talking to, I think, one of Mother Teresa's sisters, or maybe it was a priest, and said he could tell that her entire disposition changed. And I think he just called it that little box, right? You know, I think it was a pyx, or that at times that was brought to Mother Teresa, and that her entire body, her entire mannerisms changed when the host was brought to her. And he, as a Hindu doctor, didn't understand what that was, but he could even visually see there's something fundamentally different about her and the way she's acting and being because of this host is now in the room. To your question about what's different, well, in a sense, nothing's different. Again, the host might be bigger that's placed in the monstrance, but it's not qualitatively different. It's not more Jesus or Jesus in a different way. It's just being exposed. So now, because when the hosts are in the tabernacle, it's usually a metal enclosure, and so you can't see it in there. You know that it's in there because, again, the red candle, but you can't see it because of the metal enclosure. So really, taking it out, putting it in monstrance gives you the opportunity to visually see it, which might give you a different worship experience or prayerful experience. So that's good. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And maybe I'm misunderstanding your question, but there's nothing fundamentally different about the Eucharist, whether it's in a tabernacle or in a monstrance.
Yeah, no, that was perfect. I mean, just for people, let them know when they're going to church and pray. I mean, in silence. I mean, how those two things were being seen. Now, you mentioned it. I mean, the word tabernacles at the beginning, and now we have our tabernacle inside the church. We kept that name. There is anything so you want unfold about?
Yeah. So I think you're hinting at Our Lady. Right, Our Lady is often called the tabernacle, right? So she was the first tabernacle, if you will, that when she was pregnant with Jesus, she housed him in her womb, and so she is often, one of her titles is a tabernacle in the sense that she, because Jesus was in her womb, was sort of the first tabernacle. So she was the place where Jesus resides, where God resides. I think that's what you're getting at.
Yeah, that one, but as well on the beginning of your slides, you spoke about the tabernacle on the David. So that was a tent that was where was doing. I mean, it's like, how come we kept the same name? Yeah, that part there.
Yeah. So you're asking, why is it that Catholics call the tabernacle the tabernacle?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think of all the Christian, well, Catholics don't consider ourselves a denomination, but when you think about all the sort of denominations of Christianity, or the branches of Christianity, Catholicism, I would argue, is the most Jewish of all of them, right? I mean, Protestants will sometimes talk about their altar, and they'll have an altar call. But what happens at an altar? And a sacrifice happens at an altar. But Protestants don't believe that their communion service is a sacrifice. We talk about the sacrifice of the Mass, that and this gets into sort of complicated or nuanced theology. We're not doing a new sacrifice at the altar, but representing the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. Again, that's a tangent we probably don't need to get into.
No. Yeah.
At the altar in the parish, where the sacrifice of Jesus is represented, you've got the tabernacle, you've got the priest, right? You and I as laymen, we can't consecrate the bread and wine. And a lot of Catholics don't quite understand the Jewishness of the parish, of the altar, of what we're doing. What do? Every Mass has a psalm, right? The Psalms are deeply Jewish tradition. So, you can think of Brant Petree's book, Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist. That's a wonderful book. I would recommend anybody read that. And Catholicism in particular is very Jewish. So this idea of the tabernacle, Jesus being in the tabernacle in a parish, that's just one of many very Jewish elements to the Jewish Mass and to Catholic life in general.
Thank you. Thank you so much. From all the questions that people ask you so far, there is anyone that, any of those ones that, with your answer regarding the Eucharist was the most helpful for them to understanding some of their stumbling blocks?
Yeah, I think just and I'll admit this myself, that most Catholics, we if we know the Bible, we know the New Testament better than the Old Testament. The Old Testament is complicated. It assumes an understanding of Jewish history, Jewish thought, Jewish life that is not explicitly mentioned, and so you sort of have to know about it. Whereas, the stories of the Gospels are pretty easy. Jesus casting out demons or healing people, and it's just an easier text for 21st century Christians to get a hold of. And so I think light bulbs go on when I talk about this. And to be clear, I'm not inventing this or coming up with this or realizing this all on my own. In fact, I'm just simply repeating what the tradition of the Church has said. But because oftentimes Catholics don't know the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, light bulbs go on when they say, oh, when I talk about the Old Testament section, that first section of the presentation of the temple, the tabernacle, God dwelling with his people in the desert, the Israelites. And so then they are able to make the connection. So they often know those stories that I talk about in the New Testament, the bread of life discourse. Catholics obviously know the story of the Last Supper, but making that connection with the Old Testament is often new to most people.
That's great. Thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else that you wanna tell to the audience where they can find you? How there is any other material that you presenting, or this is just a specific one that in case if somebody wanna call you or hire you to bring it to their own parish?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to do this. And already I've gotten one invitation from somebody who saw me at that Glendale presentation, a woman who works for the Archdiocese. So I'll be giving a virtual talk, kind of exactly what I just did in October. But I'm more than happy to come to parishes or Newman centers or something, RCIA groups. So you can contact me at stuartsquires.com. And as I already mentioned, that what we just talked about comes from a chapter in a book that's coming out in fall 2023. And that book is called You Will Be Changed Into Me, The Fruits of the Eucharist. So you'll be changed into me is a quotation from Augustine. His confession, St. Augustine, hears this voice from on high, and God saying, this food that you're eating, Usually when we eat food, we change the food into what we need, fuel, right? Calories for our bodies. But when we eat this food, the bread of life, we're not changing the food. We are being changed into God, right? The technical term is deification. And so this book talks about the fruits of the Eucharist, the different ways that we are transformed or changed by receiving the Eucharist.
Doctor, thank you so much. Angelo was raving about the presentation when he heard it in person and was happy to have you on. It's been awesome to hear this, and I hope that a lot of you have benefited from this. Please like this video, share it with others. As I said earlier, we're still raising funds to complete the movie, The New Manna, and hopefully get this message spread across the world. So please visit our website, thenewmannamovie.com. Have a blessed day, and God love you.